The sun was just creeping over the horizon when I stepped out into my pasture, coffee in hand, ready for the usual morning routine. Check the fences, feed the cattle, make sure everything was in order. The smell of fresh grass, the soft lowing of the cows, it was the kind of calm that makes you forget the chaos of the world outside. And then I saw it. A ribbon of concrete, gray and shining in the early light, cutting straight through the middle of my pasture. Right through the land where my cows had grazed for years. Right where I had walked a dozen times that morning. Right where I had planned to continue raising livestock without interruption. A bike path. The HOA had built a bike path. Right here. On my active, living, breathing farmland. I blinked. Then I blinked again. Cows scattered nervously as the first few cyclists came barreling down the path, oblivious to the bovine chaos around them. Fences had been knocked down. Gates blocked. And all I could think was, how does this even happen? How does an HOA decide to pour concrete through someone's livelihood without so much as a warning? I walked along the path, shaking my head, trying to process it. The grass was crushed, the earth disrupted, and my cows looked at me as if to say, "This is your mess now." It wasn't just a path. It was a statement, and it was about to turn my quiet, predictable life upside down. I couldn't believe my eyes. The bike path ran straight through the heart of my pasture, like a line drawn through the middle of my life. Every step I took along that concrete strip felt surreal. My cows didn't understand it either. A few clustered nervously near the edges, lowing in confusion, while others poked at the fence posts that had been torn down during construction. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Drone footage, close-ups of the broken fences, signs that shouted "bike path" in bright yellow letters. I needed proof that this wasn't some abstract inconvenience, but an actual disruption of my livelihood. Then I called the HOA office. "Hi, yes, this is Sohail Bada," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just noticed a bike path has been constructed through my pasture. Did anyone check that this is active farmland?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then a voice, calm and slightly amused, replied, "Oh, we didn't realize this was actively used. We thought it was common property." I stared at my phone. Common property? I wanted to scream. My cows were grazing there yesterday. I had literally been feeding them there this morning. "What do you mean, common property? This is my land. My cattle are here. My fences, my responsibility." Another pause. The line crackled. "Well, we can discuss options." We weren't aware. Options? That didn't sound like accountability. That sounded like, figure it out yourself, and don't bother us too much. I hung up, my hands shaking with frustration. My cows milled around me, unbothered by the bureaucracy, but I knew the real damage wasn't just in the concrete or the broken fences. It was in the disruption of their routine. Cattle are creatures of habit. Mess with their feeding patterns, their grazing routes, their sense of safety, and suddenly a pasture becomes a source of stress instead of sustenance. I started walking the length of the path, surveying the destruction. Every section told the same story: flattened grass, churned up dirt, and fences that had been ripped from their posts. I could already see the spots where my herd had been scratched or bruised, trying to navigate the new obstacle. And worse, the path bisected their main grazing area. I'd have to completely rethink how to rotate them across the pasture. The neighbors came by next. One by one, they peeked over their fences, curious about the commotion. "Did the HOA really put a bike path through your cows?" one asked, incredulous. "Yes," I said flatly, trying to mask my anger with disbelief. Apparently, my cows weren't on the map. By mid-morning, the first cyclists started showing up. Young kids, parents, enthusiasts, all happy, oblivious, and speeding past my herd. One of my cows bolted into a fence post, startling a whole cluster of others. A few riders swerved, narrowly avoiding disaster. I wanted to shout, to throw up a barrier, to do anything, but I also knew the legal line was blurry. This was HOA property, sort of. The path existed. The concrete was poured. The damage was done. So, I did what any farmer faced with absurdity would do. I improvised. I grabbed rolls of temporary fencing, stringing barriers along the path to keep my cows safe and give them some breathing space. I patched broken gates with baling wire and rope. It was messy, it was temporary, and it was infuriating, but at least my herd was no longer panicking. Still, as I walked back along the path, surveying the temporary fixes, one thought kept repeating in my mind. How could they just forget about my land? Forget about the cows? The answer, I realized, was that they hadn't. The HOA hadn't forgotten, they had assumed. Assumed that my pasture was expendable, assumed that my cows could adapt, assumed that I would just move things around and smile while they built their perfect little path. And that assumption, that careless disregard, was going to cost them. I wasn't about to let a slab of concrete dictate the life of my pasture or my cattle. Not without a fight. By sunset, the temporary fencing was in place, the cows had calmed, and I was left standing at the edge of the path, looking down its perfectly straight line cutting through my land. I felt a mix of exhaustion, anger, and determination. The HOA had made a mistake, a massive, glaring mistake. And if they thought they could ignore the people who actually lived and worked here, they had another thing coming. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of cows milling nervously along the temporary fencing I had installed. The sun was barely up, but the tension in the pasture was already palpable. The bike path had sliced through my land like an uninvited intruder, and my herd was paying the price. Some cows were skittish, others had managed to squeeze past the makeshift barriers, and a few were stuck near the torn-down sections of the old fence. I knew I had to act fast. This wasn't just about property lines anymore, it was about safety. One misstep, one startled cow, and it could become a nightmare. But even as I tried to calm them down, I could feel the frustration building inside me. This wasn't just a small inconvenience. The HOA had created chaos in what had been a perfectly functioning system. After a quick breakfast, I drove to the HOA office. I wasn't going to wait for them to realize their mistake on their own. I needed answers, accountability, and maybe, just maybe, a solution that didn't involve permanent damage to my pasture. The receptionist looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. "You're here about the bike path?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "Yes," I said. "I need to speak to someone in charge immediately." After what felt like an eternity, the HOA manager finally emerged. He was polite, professional, and completely unprepared for the storm I was about to unleash. "Mr. Bada," he began cautiously, "we didn't realize this was active farmland. We thought it was open space, common property." I took a deep breath and let the frustration I had been holding back spill out. "Open space? My cows have been grazing here for years. Fences, gates, water troughs, do you see any of that? This is my livelihood you've disrupted. You've created a safety hazard for my animals, and you've ignored the impact on my property. How could you not check before building a concrete path through it?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we were trying to create a community amenity, a safe place for cycling." "Amenity," I interrupted. "For the community. At the expense of my farm. At the expense of my cows. You call that an amenity?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing there wasn't a good answer. The weight of my words seemed to hang in the office like a storm cloud. After hours of back and forth, a compromise was reluctantly proposed. They could install temporary barriers along the path to protect the cattle. They could reroute a small section of the path if I agreed to help fund it. But they weren't willing to tear up the entire path. The concrete was poured, and in their eyes, that made it permanent. I left the office feeling frustrated, but also more determined. Temporary fixes weren't enough. I needed a plan, a real plan to protect my herd, my pasture, and my livelihood. I spent the afternoon surveying the damage, mapping grazing rotations, and figuring out how to minimize stress for my cows. By evening, I had a strategy. Fencing in key sections, rerouting water troughs, creating safe grazing zones on either side of the path. It was going to be a lot of work, but it was doable. The cows, sensing the new structure, gradually calmed down. The herd huddled together near the edges of the pasture, warily observing the intruding path. As the sun set, I stood at the edge of the newly fenced area, looking down the straight line of concrete that had so audaciously sliced through my land. I clenched my fists, thinking about the HOA's arrogance, the disruption, the frustration, and the challenge ahead. They had assumed I would just accept it, that I would compromise my cows' safety and my livelihood for their project. But assumptions like that often come with consequences. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next steps were clear. Protect the cows, document every issue, and push back against the HOA until they realized that active farmland isn't something you pave over without repercussions. And one thing was certain. I wasn't about to let a concrete path dictate the life of my pasture. The next morning, I woke up to what can only be described as chaos. The cows had figured out that the temporary fencing wasn't as solid as I thought. A few had managed to squeeze through weak spots, while others were nervously pacing along the bike path, spooking one another. The herd had gone from calm grazing to full-on stress mode in just a few hours. I sprinted outside, heart pounding. One of my older cows had backed into a fence post and was stuck between the path and the fence. A young calf was bleating loudly, trying to follow its mother. A cyclist came around the bend, oblivious, narrowly missing the calf. I waved my arms and shouted, but there was no time to explain. The moment felt like a disaster waiting to happen. By mid-morning, I realized this was bigger than just a few temporary fixes. The concrete path had effectively bisected my pasture, cutting off natural grazing patterns and forcing the cows into smaller, unfamiliar zones. Stress levels were high, and stressed cattle can mean injuries, lost weight, and even long-term health problems. My livelihood was at stake. I grabbed my phone and started recording everything: drone footage of the path cutting through the herd, close-ups of broken fences, calves trapped behind barriers. If this was going to be an argument with the HOA, or worse, a legal case, I needed undeniable proof. Every misstep, every hazard, every sign of disruption had to be documented. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the HOA office, determination fueling me. This time, I wasn't asking, they needed to understand the full scope of the damage. "Do you see what this path is doing?" I asked the manager, holding up my phone to show the video footage. "This isn't a community amenity. It's a threat to my cows, my pasture, and my livelihood. Look at the calves trying to follow their mothers. Look at the broken fences. This is active farmland, not a park trail." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the footage. We weren't aware of the impact to this level. "We can try to make adjustments." "Adjustments?" I shot back. "You poured concrete through my pasture. Temporary fixes won't work. You need to acknowledge the damage and work with me to protect my herd, now." The conversation ended with vague promises to review the situation and potentially fund some fencing or minor reroutes, but it was clear they didn't intend to remove the path. Concrete is permanent, and in their eyes, the path was already done. I left the office, exhausted but more determined than ever. If the HOA wouldn't fully rectify the situation, I would have to get creative. I spent the evening designing a comprehensive plan. Reinforced fencing, portable barriers, temporary gates, and a new grazing rotation schedule to minimize stress. It was exhausting work, but it was necessary. That night, I walked the edge of the pasture, looking down the straight line of concrete that had appeared out of nowhere. The moonlight cast long shadows over the path, highlighting the intrusion. I could hear the lowing of the herd, unsettled and uneasy. The path wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a psychological one. My cows were stressed, my land disrupted, and the HOA had no idea just how wrong they'd been. One thought kept repeating in my mind: assumptions like theirs have consequences. They assumed my pasture could be paved over without repercussions. They assumed my cows would adapt. They assumed I would accept their negligence. But assumptions are dangerous, especially when they involve someone's livelihood. And now, the real challenge had begun. Protecting my cows wasn't just about fencing or barriers anymore. It was about strategy, persistence, and proving to the HOA that you don't build a concrete path through a living, breathing pasture without paying the price. This was turning into a battle, and I wasn't backing down. The sun hadn't even risen, but the pasture was already in chaos. My cows were on edge, pacing nervously along the concrete line that had become their unwanted boundary. The temporary fencing was holding barely. I could hear the calves bleating, mothers lowing anxiously, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of a cyclist approaching. I sprinted out, coffee still in hand, adrenaline pumping. Today wasn't just another day. This was the day I was going to prove that my pasture and my livelihood weren't going to be bulldozed or ignored. The first cyclist rounded the bend, oblivious to the herd, and I had to step onto the path to wave them back. "Watch out, cows!" I shouted. The rider swerved, barely avoiding a collision with a startled calf. I shook my head, frustrated beyond words. This bike path wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was dangerous. By mid-morning, I had gathered every piece of evidence I could. Photos, videos, drone footage, and even witness statements from neighbors who had watched the chaos unfold. It was time to escalate. I drafted a formal complaint to the HOA, detailing every hazard, every incident, every disruption. But I knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. So I acted. I reinforced the fencing, set up temporary gates at strategic points, and rearranged grazing rotations to keep my herd calm. I marked the path with bright warning signs, making it clear that this wasn't just a recreational trail, it was cattle territory now. And then, the unexpected happened. A group of cyclists ignored the signs. One of them startled a bull, which charged across the path in panic. The temporary fencing gave way in one section, and chaos erupted. Cows ran in every direction. Calves screamed. I ran, dodging animals and trying to restore order. By the time I managed to secure the herd, I was sweating, bruised, and utterly exhausted. I knew this was the turning point. The HOA had to understand that a concrete path cannot coexist with active farmland without consequences. I sent them the footage, highlighting the hazards, the damage, and the near misses. I requested an urgent meeting, making it clear that if they didn't act, I would escalate further. Legal action, county intervention, anything necessary to protect my land. The meeting was tense. I laid everything out. Videos, photos, injuries, potential liabilities, and the ongoing stress on my herd. The HOA manager tried to argue that it was for the community, but I countered with the reality on the ground. Cows in panic, broken fences, calves in danger, and my livelihood at risk. After hours of back and forth, they finally acknowledged the severity of the situation. Temporary fencing, additional safety measures, and a partial reroute of the path were agreed upon. It wasn't perfect, but it was a victory. My cows were safe, my pasture was partially restored, and I had proven that the assumption, the pasture can be paved over, was dead wrong. By sunset, I stood at the edge of the path once again. The cows were calm, grazing peacefully near the reinforced fences. The chaos of the day was over, but the lesson was clear. Assumptions, negligence, and oversight have real consequences, especially when they involve living creatures and someone's livelihood. As I watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the concrete path that had caused so much turmoil, I realized this wasn't just a story about a bike path. It was a story about respect for land, for animals, and for people who depend on both. The path would remain, but the rules had changed. My pasture, my cows, and my voice were no longer invisible. The HOA had learned a lesson I hoped they wouldn't forget. You don't build on someone's life without consequences. And neither do I.